The gospel reading contains a parable about, well, what is it about? Some have suggested that this account may echo common advice of the day. Jesus' parables then illustrate an obvious point, usually give us spiritual shaking, make us stop and think, and look closely at ourselves. In this case, the shaking may come in the words that follow the parable when Jesus advises us on who we should invite to our parties, especially those whom we make room in our lives, our churches, and our communities. Let us listen closely for the good news for us in Luke 14, 7 through 14. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place, and then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you're invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteousness.
Our epistle reading and focus lesson is from the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 13, verses 1 through 8 and 15 and 16. It emphasizes faith. The unknown author goes on to list practical implications of this faith. Beginning with love and hospitality, it is almost all about relationship. So let us listen to the author's advice as we read from the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 13, the selected verses. Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels. Remember those who are in prison, as though in prison with them, and those who are ill-treated, since you are also in the body. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the immoral and the adulterous. Keep your life free from love of money, and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never fail you nor forsake you. Hence we can say confidently, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? Remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Through him, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is, the fruit of our lips that acknowledge his name, and do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. The word of the Lord through the author of the letter. Praise be. Amen. A few children were asked what it meant to get along with others and to do the right thing. So I share with you a few of the responses. They addressed it to God. So, dear God, I bet it's very hard for you to love all of everybody in the whole world. There are only 4 people in our family, and I can never do it. Signed, Nancy. Dear God, summer camp, next summer camp, please send Dennis Clark to a different camp. Signed, Peter. Dear God, maybe Cain and Abel would not kill each other so much if they had their own rooms. It works out okay with me and my brother. Signed, Larry. Dear God, thank you for the baby brother, but what I asked for was a puppy. I never asked for anything before. You can look it up. Signed, Joyce. Dear God, is it true that my father won't get in heaven if he uses his golf words in the house? Signed, Anita. Dear God, is Reverend Keating a friend of yours, or do you just know him through the business? Signed, Donnie. And I guess this last one, I think I would hope that we all can be the signers for that. But it says, Dear God, I'm doing the best I can, really. Signed, Frank. This portion of the letter of the Hebrews that I read is kind of giving us some instruction, some encouragement. And originally it was written to a community of Jewish Christians. And the letter, very specifically says, let mutual love continue. I had a confirmation class in which I asked them to memorize a verse, and they wanted the shortest possible verses. In the New Revised Standard Version, I think that is translated as let brotherly love continue. 4 words. Let mutual love continue. 4 words. One of them said Jesus wept. 2 words. But the focus is to let mutual love, brotherly love, familial love continue. In this particular time in which when the author is writing to the community, they are under persecution, that many of the members who professed to be Christian were taken into captivity, placed in prison, and some of them were killed. And so the encouragement is to continue to remember to love those that are not with us, that those that are imprisoned for whatever the reason. And then the words continue about not being obsessed with money, to not be greedy, to keep the marriage bed faithful, to not be adulterous. So, good rules to live by. And I think if more of us lived by them, there would be less problems in the world that we'd have to deal with. Now, there was a big burly man who visited the pastor's home, and he asked to see the minister's wife because it was well known that she was very charitable with her impulses. So he said, Madam, I wish to draw your attention to a terrible plight of a poor family in this district. The father is dead, the mother is too ill to work, and there are 9 children that are starving, and they're about to be turned out into the cold, empty streets unless someone pays their rent, which amounts to $700. How terrible, exclaimed the preacher's wife. May I ask who you are? And the sympathetic visitor applied the handkerchief to his eyes. He said, I'm the landlord. That's not very charitable. On his part. But this is where, the illustration that I have on the bulletin today. My first dealings with my wife, Trudy, was finding out that she and her husband at the time owned many properties. They had about 23 rental units. And so my first question to her after meeting her and finding that out was, I asked her directly, are you a slum landlord? maybe not the best way to start out a friendship. Needless to say, she was taken aback and said, well, no, we take care of our properties and try to maintain them as best as we can and to find good renters for them. My experience in Cleveland was that, and this was one of those used-to-be tours. I talked about going to West Virginia. Well, this one was a used-to-be tour going back to Cleveland, and I was showing some of the places that I used to live at. And as I went into the city of Cleveland, I went down this one street, and the house was gone. It was torn down. I went down another street, the house that I used to live in. It was gone. It had been torn down. There were 3 houses that I had lived in that were all torn down. Now, I didn't think back in those days that I was living in a slum area, and maybe it wasn't quite slum, but it was definitely a depressed area. And the landlords did not take care of the properties, hence they got torn down at some point. But for a young man starting out in life, it was cheap rent. So my question in that experience was to Trudy, are you a slum landlord? And as I got to know her and our friendship developed, she ended up divorcing her husband, and in the process of divorcing him, they had to sell property after property after property. The big winner of this divorce was the lawyers, because they had to keep selling properties to pay the lawyer fees. Finally, it got down to the point where her husband said, I'm not going to take care of the properties anymore, and I'm going to hand them over to you. And he just took the lock, stock, and barrel and walked away from them. I think the 23 units had been dropped down to about 12 at that point. But there were 3 that were in quite an arrears of rent by 4, 5, 6 months in arrears. And so Trudy went trying to collect from them. And she went to one, and she was greeted with a man that came out with a shotgun and said, this is my property, you're not going to kick me off of it. And she didn't want to argue with him, but she contacted the sheriff, and they began talking about, Eviction, yes, thank you. Yeah, it was right on the tip of my tongue, eviction. She went to another property that was 6 months in arrears, and the guy was genuinely concerned, at least he appeared that way to be, and he said, I'll work it off, I'll work on the properties and fix them up for you, and we can chalk that off. And she said, all right, that sounds like a fair deal. After several months, she found out that he hadn't done anything, and so she went through the process of evicting him. Her husband moved out of the unit that he lived in. She had to evict her husband's girlfriend to say how difficult things were. But there was one particular woman who she ended up time after time trying to contact and to no avail, no response, nothing. And so she contacted the legal system to begin eviction. And she was to go to court, so she went into the waiting area to meet with the judge and was sitting there, and as she was sitting there, another young woman came in and sat down. And as she was sitting there, the janitor came by, and he looked over at the other woman that was sitting there. He said, "Oh, Kelly, hey, how you doing?" And she said, pretty good. And then a couple lawyers that Trudy had recognized came by, and they completely ignored Trudy, but went up to Kelly and said, "Hey, Kelly, good to see you again. How's it going?" So the judge finally opened the door, and he looked out, and he said, "Oh, hi, Kelly." And then looked at Trudy and said, "You two can come in." Apparently, Kelly then was the woman that Trudy was trying to evict. And so he brought them into the chambers, and he said, "We can mediate this without a lawsuit." And both of them said that's really what they would like to have done. And so he said, "Kelly, you owe these 6 months." And she said, "Yes, I do. I'm not going to deny it." He says, well, you need to pay it. And she said, well, I'll work out a plan to pay it. And he said, fine, okay. So sign the papers. They signed the papers. And then Trudy looked at her and says, well, is there a reason why you couldn't pay your rent for 6 months? And she said, well, I was pregnant and I couldn't work. And she said, was it a problem pregnancy? And she said, no, and didn't offer any other information. So she ended up leaving, and Trudy was about to get up and leave as well. And the judge said, wait a minute, Trudy, just wait, just a moment. And so they shut the door, and he looked at her and says, give Kelly a chance, because she can pay the rent. And she says, well, how can she come up with 6 months back rent? He says, well, she's a stripper at the local strip club. Hence why she couldn't work while she was pregnant. But the ending story was that Kelly skipped out. She didn't pay anything. She just skipped out one night on the property. So you have slumlords, and then you have other rascals that take advantage of others as well. But the reason why I share this story, though, is not to lift up the negative, but to say in spite of the negative. I mean, Trudy continued to work with those that were having difficulty. There was a particular woman named Maria who had a child, and when they had first rented, they were a family unit, husband, wife, and child. The husband left. The wife wasn't working. She couldn't pay the rent, and the child was disabled. And Trudy worked with this woman, and this woman went out, got a job, found a babysitter for the child, got directed to several social agencies to help, and the net result was that the woman eventually was able to pay what Trudy had assigned as due, because she gave her a discount on the rent as well at that point. And the woman ended up going to school and completing the program and became a social worker. So there was a success story in that. And I think that's what this letter to the Hebrews is telling us, that, there are challenges in our life and there are obstacles, but in that we continue to persevere, to hold faith, to be, as other scripture says in Matthew, I believe, where to be as wise as serpents, but as gentle as doves, or as loving as doves, to provide the care for those with the wisdom that God gives to us. And in that application of love with wisdom, perhaps we don't become a victim, and we're able to lift up and help other victims to be empowered and to find their way, as we all are trying to do in this thing called life. And so, hold this letter of the Hebrews to your heart, to let mutual love continue, and to be faithful to a God that is ever faithful. Amen.